Hello everyone and welcome to this new live no coding session in which we are going to create a clone of the WhatsApp web app using the Sketch.io platform. So this is what the WhatsApp looks like, and we're going to replicate that with all the functionality with Sketch. So before we start, I just want to say that I've built this small layout interface already to save time. And without further ado, we can start creating the actual features and all that is missing to make this chat app work. So first we need to create a model for our users, and that is because for people to be able to use our app, they need to create an account. They need to register. So we're going to create a new data model, and it's going to be called users. All right. And the first field in this data model is the username. So every user will have their own username, and it's a required field. It is a unique field, so two users cannot have the same username, and we're going to index this field for faster retrieval from the data model. And we can save. Then we can create a password field that will hold the password of that user. It is required as well. And finally, we're going to create an image field, and that is the profile picture of our user. All right, we can hit save, and we're pretty much done for this first part. Now you can add even more fields, so you can add a bio, you can add a real name, you can add many more fields, an email if you want, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to keep things very simple. So now we have a user's data model. We can save. And now what we need to do is to work on our homepage so that we can show a register, a sign up form, or a login form depending if the user is logged in or not. So this app wrapper will hold the content of our page. So we can add, maybe we can start by adding a logo. I've already built a small logo. So let's modify this. Gonna search for the logo. Alright, it's on my computer. So it's gonna be this image. Alright, select it. And this is our logo. Now the image is oversized. We need to reduce the size of the image. Maybe we can set the height to maybe 150 pixels. All right, so this is the logo, maybe a little bit less, maybe 120. All right, and now we can add maybe the actual forms of our page. Now we want two forms, so one for login and one for registering. So I'm gonna first add a div block, just like this. All right, and this div block will contain both login and sign up forms. So this one is login and the other one is for sign up. Now I also want to add the titles for these forms. So it's going to be an H1. So this one is going to be login. And the other one is for sign up. All right. Now we want to display them one next to the other, and for that we'll put them inside their own div blocks. So I think the structure right now is a little bit messy. So this will hold both forms, and this one will hold the login form specifically, just like this. And we do the same thing with the sign up form. All right, so move it here, and just like that. All right, and this block will be the, I'm gonna call it the home forms. This one I'm gonna call it login, and this one is for sign up. this one is inside of the login. We need to put it outside of the login form. Just like this. All right. And now we can play a little bit with the layout so that things look much prettier. So we're gonna use flex into the horizontal direction, align the items to the start, and then we can select the login form, and we can give it a grow value of 1, a base size of 0, and same for the sign up form, grow 1 and base size of 0. So now they both take 50% of the width. And then we can maybe add one last thing, which is maybe a border to separate them. So I'm gonna add a right border, a left border I mean. So 1 pixel here. And we're gonna put it very light like this. All right. Now maybe for the logo we can add a margin. Well, this is the inner margin. I need to put an outer margin, just like this. All right. So we can save. Now we did add these forms, but we need to configure them properly. So this is the login form. We go to the properties and we need to select the data model that will contain the users, which is the users data model. Now the identifier is the username. This is the handle of the field, and the password is password. And then we can do the same with the sign up. So users, which fields we want to show. Maybe we can just show some specific fields. So the username and the password. We don't need to show the profile picture field right away. Here we have username. All right, and we're ready to move on with this. So here we have the user's data model. If we open it, we have no entries in this data model because no user has signed up yet. Now we can go to the preview and we can refresh this page. All right, so this is our page so far. We cannot log in because there's no users yet, but we can sign up. So we can create maybe an account here. So let's call it like this. We can sign up, and now if you remember, the action to be taken when the user finishes signing up is to refresh the page. So we did create the account, but we need to log in the person now. So let's go back here. Now we can see in the user's data model we have this new account that was created. And what we need to do now is to show the user the actual WhatsApp app rather than just the homepage with the forms. So to do that, we need to create a new page, and it's going to be the chats page. And the URL will be just /app, and we can save. So I'm going to open this page. I'm going to add the boilerplate styling, just like this. All right. So this will contain the actual app, so the list of conversations and the chat. Now what we need to do in the home page is to go to the page controller here and to basically redirect the user to the app page whenever they are logged in. And we have here in the page setup module, user logged in. This input will allow us to know if the user is logged in or not. And depending on that, we can take different actions. So we're going to go to program flow and use a simple condition. Now the input of this condition is whether the user is logged in or not. And if the user is logged in, so if this is true, then we will apply a specific action. And that action will be a redirect. Just like this, and redirect to the app page. So we can save. Now for the app page, we need to do the same thing, but if the user is not logged in, we need to redirect them to the home page instead. So it's really the same logic. Now if the user is logged in, this will be the logic of the app. Otherwise, we want to redirect the user to the home page. Alright, so we can hit save. And now I'm going to go back to the home page and I'm going to refresh this page. And you'll see that when I'm going to refresh the page, the URL will automatically redirect to the app page. So let's see. Alright, so you see it redirected to the app page and the content is empty because the user is logged in. Alright, so now we can go back and now we can start working on the actual chat, and we want it to look something like this. Alright, so let's think a little bit of how we can make the layout. So I like to use Flexbox, which is a very neat way to set up pages, and we need to set it up so that we have two columns, one for the sidebar, so the list of conversations, and the other one for the current conversation. So for that, we need to set up, I'm going to add a div block here, and we will make this div block stretch and flex, just like this. So it's going to fill the whole area. Now I noticed that we have some margin in the parent element, so we need to remove that. Perfect. So now we have a div block inside of the app wrapper, and this div block will be a flex, and the direction is horizontal. We want to stretch the content, and for justify we want to stretch as well. Alright, now we can add both columns. So the first one is gonna be the left sidebar. So left sidebar, and the second one is gonna be the right sidebar. Okay, now here, as you notice, when we create a div block, it automatically has an inner margin, and that is so that you can actually see it when you add it, but we want to remove this, so we'll reset this style. Alright, and now for these two sidebars, we want them to flex to fill the whole area. So I'm gonna first remove this margin, and I'm going to use grow 1, base size of 0. Alright, so this one fills now the whole area, it grows. And for the second one, we apply the same thing. So let's go back here, let's reset this style, let's go back to the class, and this one will grow again with a base size of 1. But this one is not a grow value of 1, we want it to grow to a value of 2. So this one will take one area, while this one takes 2 areas. Perfect, so now we have both columns and we can start adding the rest of the elements. So this one is going to be the header, so sidebar header. I'm going to add a class. Alright, I'm going to give it a specific color and height. So for the color, I'm gonna pick this color. Alright, and for the height, I'm gonna set it to maybe 100 pixels or maybe 70 pixels. Yeah, maybe 40 or 50. Alright. Alright, and now we want to just make sure that the sidebars have yeah, I made a mistake here. I did apply it directly on the element rather than on the class. So let's just reset these values. So this one is 1, this one is 0, I'm gonna put 1, then 0. Alright, then we can go and reset these values, and that's good. Alright, now we need, as I said, to set these elements to be flex as well, and it's going to be a flex, this time vertical, and we want to stretch the elements inside. So the elements, we don't want to center them, we want to stretch them through this whole area. Same for this. Perfect. Now we can add another sidebar header here. Perfect. We can save. Now inside of this header we have a small image. So that is the profile picture of the current user. So I'm gonna set here the dimension of the image to be maybe 40 pixels by 40 pixels. Alright, I'm gonna add some radius. Perfect. Save. And then I also want to add a button here to create new conversations. So I'm gonna add an icon. Alright, I'm gonna change the icon for maybe the paper plane. I'm gonna add a class icon. I can set the color. I'm gonna pick the exact color, just like this. Alright, and maybe increase the size a little bit. Okay, now we want this icon to be here, and for that I'm gonna select the parent, so this sidebar, and here in the settings I'm gonna set it to flex, horizontal, and for justify I'm gonna set space between, just like this, and for the align I'm gonna choose center. Perfect. I'm also gonna remove these default values and set an inner margin of 10 pixels here and 10 pixels there, just like that. Alright. Now we can hit save. I'm going to also set this icon to have a pointer cursor. So instead of this regular cursor, we want a pointer instead, so that it's a button, just like that. Now let's look at the result so far, and here it is. So we have this create new conversation icon. We have the profile picture of the current user. Alright, so now I'm just gonna set the profile picture of our user. I'm gonna edit it right away here, and let's choose an image. Alright, so now our user has a profile picture. And now here, as I said, we want to display the picture, the profile picture of the current user that is logged in. How to do that? You go to the page controller, and here we have the user account, and this contains the entry of our user. So we need to store the information of the user. We need to expose them, and we're going to store this into this variable, and this variable is going to be user. So the user variable will contain the information from the current user that is logged in. Alright. And now we can take, we know that in the user's information we have the profile picture. The handle of that is profile-picture. So we can set here in the image, we can go to the properties and link this image to a variable, and that variable is user.profile-picture. We can link variable, we can save, and then we can try it out. So I'm going to refresh the page. Perfect. So we see here that the profile picture updated, and we can now start working on the rest of the app. So I'm going to close this. So now what we need to do is maybe list the conversations of our user. Now, how to do that? We first need to create a data model that will contain the list of conversations, and that data model will contain basically just a list of the conversations. It's not going to contain the actual messages, just the list of conversations. So create a new data model. The name is going to be conversations, and we can create this data model. Now, this list of conversations will have two fields. The first one is the first user that is in that conversation, and the second field is the second user. And it's not going to be their usernames, it's going to be their IDs. So it's going to be the same ID as in the user's data model. So the first one is going to be called user1. All right, this one is required. We can index it. And the second field is going to be user2. Required and index. All right, just going to put this U in uppercase. Perfect. So this data model contains a list of conversations, and each conversation will basically store the value of the first user that is in that conversation and the value of the second user in that conversation. So ready to get going with this, we can save. And here we're gonna list basically the conversations. So I'm gonna create a div block right here, and this will be the conversation wrapper. So I'm going to add a class. We'll call it conversation list. All right, and we can set the grow value to 1 so that it fills this whole area, and a base size of 0. All right, now inside of this conversation list we have the actual conversation item or the conversation element. And that will hold an image. All right, just like this. I'm going to resize the image right away. So here, I'm going to add radius of 20 pixels. All right, and now we can add the text that will be right next to it, just like this. So this will be the username of correspondent. Alright, now this element will have a class, and this one is conversation item, and first we can reset the inner margin. Same for this one, we're going to reset this inner margin. All right, and we're going to apply it directly on the class instead. So 5 pixels everywhere seems right, and we're going to set it as a flex horizontal aligned to the center, and we can even add a margin here. So maybe 8 pixels of margin. Perfect. We can save. Now we might want to add maybe a slight border at the bottom, something very small, just to put some sort of delimitation between the list of between the conversations. Perfect. Maybe even less. So reduce the alpha to 5. All right. So we can refresh the page here, and here we have this new conversation. Now I want it to be clickable, so I'm gonna change the cursor of this element to pointer, just like this. All right. Just like this. And now what we want to do is, you notice that we have no conversation, but we have this element that shows up. We want to fill this the content of this element with the actual list of conversations. So we want to retrieve the conversations from the data model. So to do that, we're going to go into the app controller, and we're going to use in the database folder, the data retriever module. So this module will allow us to retrieve from the conversations data model some specific conversations. We don't want to retrieve all conversations in the data model. We want only to retrieve the conversations of this current user. Now, for that, the user needs to be set either as the user 1 or the user 2. So we're going to add a filter, and we want the user 1 is a specific value, but we want an input because the value is not fixed here. We want to set it as an input, and we're also going to add an OR operator because it's either user 1 or user 2. So user 2 is input. We want to retrieve, let's say, 100 conversations, and we can sort them by date modified in descending order, and we can hit OK. Now we have these two inputs, and these correspond to these input values here. So we want to link them to the ID of the user. Again, it's not the username, it's the ID of the user. It's the value here, so it's ID, or here. So this is the number that we will store in the conversations list. All right, so for that, we're going to retrieve that value. So we go to data processing, entry, and we're going to get an entries property. So the property that we want is the ID, and we want it from this entry here, the user account that is currently logged in. All right, so we can connect this, and this will be connected to both filter inputs. Perfect. So now here we have an array, so a list of entries, and these entries correspond to the conversations in our data model. Now a conversation, as I said, only has two fields, so user 1 or user 2. And what we want to do is to basically populate these fields. We want to, instead of having just the ID, we want to have the actual username of that conversation, so the corresponding person. Now, that person can either be in the user 1 field or either the user B field, the user 2 field. So we need to do some kind of logic here. So we're going to set the entry, we're going to set in an entries property. Actually, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to first populate the values of the user 1 and user 2 fields. So retrieve sub entry. So this, we take the input here, which is the raw list of conversations. And in the configuration, the field handle is going to be user 1. And this will retrieve the information from the user's database. And we'll do the same thing for user 2. Just like this. Reconnect it like this. Here it's user 2, and it's the user data model. So now we don't have only the ID of the users, we have the actual user entry displayed. Now on top of that, I'm also going to modify these entries so that in each and every entry in the conversation list will be linked, will have basically we'll have a property that will be directly the corresponding person, and that can be either the user 1 or the user 2. So for that, we're going to loop through these entries. So program flow, and it's going to be array loop. All right, so it's this value. I'm going to move this like this. All right, so here we're going to loop through each and every entry in this array, and for each and every one we're going to set a property. So entry, set entries property, and the property name is going to be correspondent. All right, And for the value, it's either the first user or the second user. So let's go to maybe program flow. And there's really different ways we can do this. All right, so if it's all right, so the value here is the ID of the user, and that is right here. And the switch will basically go to case 1 when that value is the same as this one, or case 2 when that value is the same as this one. So let's get the in data processing entry get property module, and here we're gonna get the user one, maybe .id, and we're also gonna get the user 2. So here we get the user 2 .id. All right, so the input here is the entry, and here we'll have the ID of the user 1, and here the ID of the user 2. So user 1 and user 2. So this is the loop flow. Then this, and then the switch. So if you understand properly, the switch will basically either go to this case or this case, depending on which one is equal to this value. So if our current user is the user 1, we want to set the correspondent value to user 2, so the opposite. So here the value will get user 2. So data processing entry, get entry property, user 2. And we connect it just like this. So case 1, it's user 2. And for case 2, it's user 1. And we want this value here, just like this. Alright, so this was very complicated, but I hope you really understood what we're doing here. When you know what you're doing, it's very easy to understand. So basically we have a list of correspondent, so the conversations, a list of conversations, and each and every conversation has user 1 and user 2. Let's say we have our current user, let's call him John. Sometimes John is user 1, sometimes John is user 2, depending on who created the conversation. And we want to know basically what is the username of the other person. So this is what we're doing here. We're looking at the ID that we have in user 1, and if that ID is the same as our user, so it's the same as John's ID, then we're setting the correspondent value as the user 2. And if John is user 2, we set the correspondent value to user 1. So it was really, all of this is just doing that. Now there's probably ways to make things, make this a lot easier. We could, for example, just have stored the usernames. Maybe that would have helped, but let's just move on with this now. So now we have a list of conversations, and these conversations have a correspondent value that is set to be the person that we're corresponding to. So here, now we have here, this is the item of the conversation item, and we want to loop this element so loop, through a variable, and that variable is conversations. It's set here. Actually, we never set that value, so let's do that right here. So set variable conversations, and we'll link it both ways. And the value is the value of the entries that we later modified. So let's take this. Yeah, it's a little bit far from it. Just gonna move it here, connect it, and then move it back here. All right. So now we have a conversations variable that holds the list of conversations with the added correspondent value. All right. So conversation, and the loop variable, it's gonna be conversation without an S. All right. So now here we get to the image and the div text, and we want to set these, we want to set their properties to take the profile picture from the correspondent value. So this one is going to be correspondent dot profile picture, and here it's going to be correspondent dot username. Link to variable, and now we can save this. So this was really a pain to set this up, and again, there's probably ways to make it a lot easier, but for this tutorial we took this route. All right, now we can refresh the page, and normally nothing should appear, which is normal because we have no conversations yet. So we're gonna now work on this button that will allow us to create new conversations. So this button, we can maybe use a link. So when the person clicks on it, we go to a separate page. So that page could be the new page, so new conversation. So new, just like this. And now we can add the boilerplate layout, just like this. Perfect. All right, so now we have this page. It's called new, and inside we're gonna add a form that will allow people to create a new conversations with other people. So I'm gonna first work on the page controller. Make sure that we redirect the user to the home page if they're not logged in. So we add a condition. If the user is logged in, then do something, otherwise redirect to home page. Now, if the user is logged in, again, we want to store the value for the current user. So we want to set variable, and that is the user. All right, and maybe now we can work on the actual form. All right, so let's add a heading. So this is create a new conversation. We can add a form. In the form container, we have a form field that will contain a label. So that label is username of friend. And then we have a text input. So where it is, right here. All right, I'm gonna move things later. And we have a button. And that button is create conversation. All right, now we can take this form. Maybe we can add a class, new conversation, and we could just align stuff. We can reorder the element. All right. Yeah, maybe we don't need the form field. That's really optional. We can set the form to be flex, vertical, align to the center, and yep, that's enough. The text field or the button field, we can add maybe some margin to the top, just like this. All right. All right, so now we have a form that will allow people to type in the username of their friends so that they can create new conversations. Now this form, we need to set the method to none, so we don't want the form to actually do anything, but we're going to set it in the actions. So we can set an action that triggers whenever the form is submitted. So whenever the person hits the create conversation, we can submit this form. All right, now what do we want to do when a conversation is created? We want to first check that the username that the person typed in is not the same as themselves. So we don't really want people to create conversations with themselves. So for that we can do, we can retrieve a variable, so get variable. And the variable name is going to be user. So that's the variable that we have set in the page controller previously. However, there's something very important here, and that is that when you set a variable in the page controller, it is not automatically available in the actions panels. So you are not able to retrieve it right like this. You need to expose the variable. You need to click here on expose variable to expose the variable so that we can use it now in the actions here. Just like this. So now we got the user, and what we can do is we can retrieve the username that the person has typed. So for that we can do element operation, or maybe page traversal, find element by tag, and we can find friend username. All right, only one match, and we need to put this tag on this text input. So in element tags we type friend username, so that now we can retrieve it in the actions. So select the form. Now we've retrieved that element. We're gonna check that the value is not the same as our current user. So here we can do entry, get entries property, and that is the username property. So this will retrieve the username of our current user, and we want to compare this value with the value of the field, of the text field. So we can element operation, and then we have get value. So this will get the value from this text input. All right, and now we want to compare this and that. So program flow, condition, comparison condition, and what we want to do is if value 1 is equal to value 2, then we want to maybe show an error message. So show message, it's an error, cannot create conversation with yourself. You cannot create conversation with yourself. All right, let's save and let's try this. So now I'm going to refresh the page. Yeah, the button is not working yet, so we need to configure that as well. So let's go to the app and let's make this button redirect to our page. We can create maybe an action or put it in a link. It's really the way you prefer. So let's go with a link. So I'm gonna add a link block, and inside of the link block we want to put the icon, just like this. And the link, we want to configure it to go to the new page. Hit save, and now if I refresh the page, now we can click on this, and now we are in the new page. Now to test what we've done so far, we can type in the same username that we've just created, which is this one. I'm gonna click on create conversation, and you see the error message. You cannot create conversation with yourself. A conversation, small typo. So let's go to new conversation, form, in the action, and here you cannot create a conversation with yourself. All right. Now, otherwise, if the username that is typed is not the same, then we can continue. We can now check if the username actually exists in our data model. So database, data retriever, and we want to go to the users data model, and we want to see if this username exists. So we link it to an input, and we only have one output. So one user could match this. So otherwise, we do this. Now we take this username. So not this one, but this one. So the one that the person has typed. So we connect it. All right. And now if we have a value here, it means that the user exists. Otherwise, it means that the user doesn't exist. So we can go to a program flow, a comparison condition. Now, if this value, if it exists, then do something, otherwise do something else. So otherwise, we want to show an error message again. And that message is user doesn't exist, or username doesn't exist. So normally now, if we type in, we can refresh the page, and if I type in something random, it says that the username doesn't exist because it checked on the database and it found that no entry matches this. So the entry is null, it doesn't exist. Otherwise, now if the entry exists, now we can create our user in the database. For that, we need to use the create request, and for that we need a create key. All right, so let's save this and let's get back to this a little bit later. So we need a create key to create a new conversation. For that, we go to database in the app controller. So that's where you can assign create keys, and you can generate a create key. All right. In the configuration, we can set the data model to conversation because we want to create a new conversation, and the fields that we want to permit are specific fields. So the user2 field is the one that we want to allow the person to set. For the user1, we can set it here in the entry defaults, and that is we need to go to data processing value, and the value is going to be an entry, and the entry is only going to have one input, one property I mean, and that is user1. Now the value is user1 is the ID of the current user, so we retrieve it. So entry, get entry property, and that is ID, and now we connect everything. All right, so now we took the ID of the current user, we've built this entry, so user1 is equal to the ID of our current logged in user, and we generate a create key using this default setting, and we're going to set the user2 depending on what the person has typed in. All right, And now we need to save this create key inside of a variable. So data processing set variable. This is the value, and we're gonna call it create conversation key. And again, we need to expose this to be able to use it in the actions. All right, so now we go back to the actions. We can retrieve the variable. This is the name of the variable. All right, and now we connect this like this. And for the data entry, we need to set the user2 value. So data processing value. This is an entry with one property. That property is user2. All right. And what is the value? So what is the ID of the user2? It's the one we retrieved here. So this is an entry, a user entry, and we want to retrieve the ID of this user. Just like this. And we connect it. All right, so let's double check that everything seems right. So we retrieve the ID, retrieve actually the user that corresponds to the one the person has typed in the form. We check if that user exists. If it doesn't exist, it means that the username is wrong. Otherwise, we get the create key, we get the ID of that user, and we create a new entry in the conversations data model, and we assign the user2 to be this value. And for user1, it's already included in the create key. That's already like in here. All right. In case of success, we can show a message, maybe a success. Conversation created. All right. Otherwise, we can just say a failure. So we can show message, error, and we take the failure message directly. Now, when we show the success message, we also want to redirect the person to the app, like this. But we want to allow maybe a small delay. So maybe, how many milliseconds? Maybe 2 seconds. So 2000 milliseconds. And we'll redirect to the app page. All right. That was a lot of work. We can save. Now, so far we don't have any other users other than me. So we're going to go to the users data model, and we can create a user. So this one is going to be test1. All right, I can get a random picture. And then another one, test2. And we get another random picture. By the way, these pictures, these people don't exist. They're computer AI generated, so no worries about their faces. All right, so we can now try this. So we refresh the page, and now we can maybe converse and with test1. And we can create conversation. Hopefully it's gonna work. Most likely it won't, but maybe it works. So create, okay. So it says username doesn't exist. All right. So let's try to debug this. All right. So the problem is that this value will never be equal to this. Yeah, so it's not a comparison condition, it should be instead just a regular condition. Alright, and this will test if this value exists or not. So if the variable exists, it means that the user exists, so we do this, otherwise we show the message. Alright, let's save, and let's try again. I'm gonna try with the user that doesn't exist, so hello. Username doesn't exist, and now let's try with test1, and hopefully, alright, conversation created, and we were redirected to the page. Now we can notice here that still there's something that doesn't work, and that is that the conversation was properly listed here, but the profile picture and the username don't work. So let's try to debug that. Now first I'm gonna go to the conversations list and let's see what we have. So these are the IDs of the conversation. So the first one is me, and the second one is the test one. So this one is me, this one is test one. Let's double check that. Yeah, that's exact. This one is me and this one is test one. All right. So now why is it that the conversations don't work? So here we loop through the conversations variable that is set right here. Yep. And we have the conversation variable. Oh, it's conversation dot correspondent dot username. Same here. Conversation dot correspondent, because correspondent is the field inside of the conversation, and so on. So hopefully now it should work. Perfect. So now we've seen that the conversation was properly listed. So we were able to list the conversation and retrieve the user that we're conversation with. Alright, so now the next step is to implement the actual chat messages area. So we need to first create a chat data model. So we're going to create a messages data model. And this data model will contain the messages that people send to one another. So we can create this data model, and the first field is going to be the conversation field. Basically, this will allow you to say that this message corresponds to a specific conversation. So we're going to call it conversation, and it's going to be the ID of the conversation. This field is required, and we can even set it as indexed field. We can save. And then the other field that we're going to create is the from field, and that is the person that has sent the message. And this is going to be the ID of the user. This one is required as well. We can save, and the to field, so the person that receives the message. And this as well will be the ID of the user. Alright, so now we have the conversation ID, the from user ID, the to user ID, and now we can add the actual message of the user. Now we can put this as a multi-line text, so people can enter multi-line texts for their messages. We can set it as required as well. Alright. Now, of course, you can add many more fields to your messages. We already have by default the ID of the message, the date created, date modified. We're not going to be able to modify fields. You can just enter and create a field. But of course, you can add even more features if you want, like a picture. You can attach maybe a picture, a link, an attachment, a video if you want. But for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to keep things simple as always. All right, so now we have created the messages data model, and we need to populate here in this sidebar. We need to, in this main area, we need to populate this with the messages of the user. So I'm going to first start by setting the area, so the interface. So I'm going to add a block here. We're going to give this a class. I'm going to first remove the margin and give it a class. And this is going to be the messages. All right. We can also set this to be a flex, a grow to 1, so that it fills this whole area. And we can give it some styling. So one thing we can do is use an image. So I'm going to upload a specific image for this field, for the background. Alright, so this is the image, and then we need to set a color. I'm going to set here this color that I took. Perfect. Alright, so this will contain the list of messages that the person has sent. Next, we can add another div block. I'm going to add it just below of it. And I'm going to remove the inner margin, add a new class, and this is going to be new message. All right. We can add maybe a height. So 40 pixels should be okay. And inside we can add a text field. So this is the actual message. Yeah, this is the actual message that the person can enter. Yeah, we don't want this to be a single line text field. We want it to be a multi-line. So let's remove it. And instead, we're going to add a multi-line text field. Just like this. And we're going to work, of course, on the styling a little bit later. I'm just going to set the basic stuff. So the background of this area. This is the border, so the background color. Alright, and here we're gonna set a class. This is gonna be message input. Right. So this one can be a flex direction like this, and align elements to the center. Right now we only have a single element, so now we can set this field to have a height of, let's say, 30 pixels, and we can add a margin or an inner margin on the parent element. Alright, for this one we can add a border radius, so maybe something like 15 pixels. We can remove the border. Alright, and maybe we can add a button. Or maybe instead of a button, we can add an icon. So let's remove this button. Or yeah, we can keep it as a button for now. So send, and we can add a margin maybe on this element. Perfect. Alright, we can save. Let's see so far what we have. Alright, so we have this, we have the button, everything looks great. So now for the logic that is going to be behind this, we need to make sure that when the person clicks on a conversation, we need to open that conversation here. So a conversation has an ID. Here, this is the conversation item, and we're going to set the ID. We're going to attach the ID to this element here. So add data entry, and we can name it conversation ID. And instead of typing something here, we can just link it like this, and we can say conversation.id, just like this. So now this element that is going to looped is going to have a data item that is attached to it. Its name is going to be conversation ID, and the value is going to be the actual ID of this conversation. So what we need to do now is that when someone clicks on this conversation, we're going to retrieve the messages in this conversation using the ID of this element. So add an action, and this action is triggered when someone clicks on it, and it's going to be open conversation. And we need to set a trigger. We need to retrieve the conversation, so we're going to use data retriever, and we're going to use from the messages data model, we're going to retrieve the ones that have a specific conversation ID, so is, and the value is going to be an input, and in order to add a layer of security to our app, we need to make sure that not only we're going to retrieve a conversation, a message from the database, but we also need to make sure that this message belongs to a conversation that this user owns. In other words, a hacker could try to change this input, so this ID, and try to retrieve conversation that do not belong to this user. So we need to add another filter, so an AND query, and we need to make sure that the from value is the same as our user ID. So here we're going to use a variable, and it's going to be user.id, or the to field. So to is equal to a variable, and that variable is user.id. This one is set as in the page controller, as we did previously. So user contains the current user, and we need to set it like this. So if you put input here, the client, so the one that opens the app, could change this value. So whenever it's input, make sure that whenever the value of that field can be anything the person can choose. Even if you do your own logic here, a hacker could bypass it. So always put a use variable here whenever you're trying to retrieve sensitive information. So here we're forcing the message to be retrieved using from or to, and it needs to belong to this specific user. All right, and we want to retrieve, let's say, 100 last messages. We need to sort them either by date modified, maybe date created, and we need to sort them in descending order. So we want the last messages. All right, we can click on OK. Now here, this input is the conversation ID. So what is the conversation ID? We have set this value into the conversation item, the button basically. We have attached the data. So now we can retrieve that data. So element operation, and we need to find here get data. And the element is the one that the person has clicked on. So this is the element, and the name is conversation ID. All right. Now the conversation ID is going to be linked to this, and we can link it like this. Now, in order to test things out, in order to debug our app, what we can do here is use the logger module to log the value of this output. So this is for testing purposes. People that use your app won't necessarily have access to this. They can if they want, but this is really for testing purposes. So we want to see intermediate values while we're editing and creating our app. So we're going to use this, and we can save. Now if we go to our app and refresh, all right, so now I'm going to click on F12 or inspect, or the inspect element, and I have it in a separate window. You might have it docked like this. I personally like to have it in a separate window like this. So now in the console, we have the logs of what the user is doing, basically. So let's try something. If I click here on this element, you can see here that it has logged an array, an empty array, and this corresponds to the list of messages of this conversation. Now, of course, we don't have messages yet in this conversation, so this is completely normal. We can close this, and we can go back here, and maybe something that we can log is to just make sure that everything is working properly. Maybe it's just the conversation ID, just to make sure that everything is okay. So the value that we should see is this one. So it ends by 25D. So let's refresh the page. Let's refresh the page. I'm gonna open the console. Maybe we can dock it like this. And let's clear things and let's click on it. All right. So you see here we have logged the conversation ID. So everything seems to be working perfectly fine so far. All right. So now when we click on this, it opens this conversation. Now what we need to do is to be able to send messages to the correspondent. So we go back here, and for that we need to get the value of this field whenever we click on the send button, and whenever we do that we need to create a new message and refresh this list of messages. Alright, so I'm gonna go in the page controller, and the idea here is that in order for us to create a message, we need to generate a create key. If you see here, I'm gonna click on this button, and this button is gonna trigger the action of sending a new message. So add a new action. Whenever it's clicked, we send a new message. So we create a new entry, so create request. The data entry is going to be the actual message. So we're going to retrieve, we're going to first get our element. So this must be the message input. And that element, we're going to retrieve the value. So get a value. And from that value, we're going to create a new message. So here we have, we need to set it to create an entry. So we go to create a value element. It's going to be an entry with basically, two values, two entries, two properties. The first one is the to element, the to property, and this is going to be the user ID of our correspondent, and the second one is going to be the message. All right, so we connect it like this. So this is the message, and here we need to get the conversation correspondent, so the ID of the user. So we're going to work on that a little bit later. Now here we need to have the create key, so we're going to generate that, and we can also, just for the sake of debugging things, log the value we have so far just to make sure that things work the way we want them to. So we can save. Let's go back to our page, open the console, refresh the page, and now we're going to click on this, and if we type something and click send, so this is the entry that we created. So it has to undefined and message is undefined. So here there is a problem. It should be the test value here, and the reason is very simple. Here we're trying to retrieve the value of the element that has this tag. We need only one, so we need to add this tag to our input, so message input. So we're going to click on this multi-line input and add this tag here. All right, save, and now when we refresh, it's gonna work perfectly fine. All right, so you see here the message was properly retrieved. All right, so now we need to set the value of the to field. So we need to know what is the ID of the person we're talking to in the current conversation. So for that, here we have the conversation ID here, and we can maybe attach even more fields. Maybe what we can do is just attach the whole conversation entry right away. We don't need to set the ID specifically, actually, so we can remove this, and instead we can just say conversation, and we can attach this to the conversation variable, just like that. All right, and when we click on it, this was not really useful. So what we're going to do is retrieve directly the whole conversation data entry. We can remove this for now. Just gonna bypass it like this. We don't need this right now. So we save, and let's see what happens now. So refresh the page, and when you click on this, so this is the conversation entry. So it has the user 1, user 2, and the correspondence, and this is the thing that we worked on. So the person we are talking to, so this is their ID. So this is the ID we need to retrieve when we send a message, and we need to set it as the to value. All right, so when you send a message, we need to get the to value. So what we're going to do here is this is the messages element. We're going to add a tag, messages. And when we click on this, we're going to attach our conversation data to this whole element here, so that we can retrieve it right away. So when we click on this, we need to find an element, and this one is messages. There's only one. And this element, we're going to set a specific value. So set data. This element, the name is conversation, and the value is this one. All right. We don't need this right now. This one is not needed as well, but we're gonna just leave it here for now. All right. So when we click on something, we need to attach the current conversation, so this one, to the messages element. Let's hit save. And when we click on this, so here we retrieved the message, and now we need to retrieve the ID. How do we retrieve the ID? We get the element, the messages element. Then we get the data, which is conversation. And from this conversation, we get a specific value. So entry, get entries property. This is the entry, the conversation entry, and we need to get the correspondent dot ID. All right. So this is this value. Let's move things around. All right, so we get the message, and here we get the correspondent ID from the data that we have set on the messages element. So we get this, and then we generate this entry and we log it to see what we have. All right, so we can now refresh the page. We can click on this, and now we can maybe type something, so test2, and when we click on send, we have here the ID of the person we're talking to and the message here that we have retrieved. So just to make sure, so 4F8, is this the ID of test1? Let's look. All right, perfect. So it's the right ID. All right, so we're almost there. Now what we need to do is to generate the create key that will allow us to save this message. So here we have to save the message. This is the data entry, and we're gonna remove this, and we need to save this message. Now for that, we need to get this create key. So in the page controller, that's where we can generate a create key, and this is the whole reason why you need to generate a create key is for security reasons. We don't want people to be able to add entries to your database just like they want. We need to generate a specific create key whenever we want someone to be able to add information to the database. So we go to database and generate a create key, just like that. Here we have the entry default, and this is where we can create a default entry. Of course, this is an entry. Now the default fields are the from field, and that's pretty much it. So just let's go back here and make sure. So the message, we're gonna have the conversation. This depends on which conversation we're referring to, and we have here the from field. All right. So it's gonna be from, and the value is the ID of the current user. So where do we have the ID of the current user? So it's right here. So we need to link this to this. So let's just move this closer. Let's link it, and now let's move it back here. All right. So here we have generated a create key. Let's configure it. So it's for messages. So it's to be able to create a new message, and the fields that the person can set are the conversation. Then we have the to field and the message field. Oops. So message. All right. And we can save this key just like this. So set variable. So this is the value, and the key is new message key. And we need to expose this variable to be able to use it in the send message action, just like this. All right. Now in send message, we have set the to and the message field, but we also need to set the conversation field. So we need 3 inputs. This one is conversation. Here we can get the variable, which is new message key. All right. And here for the conversation, we need to get the conversation ID, and that is, so this is correspondent.id, and we need to get another property, which is just the ID of the conversation. Perfect. And we get this variable, and then we can have our create key. All right, so in case things work out, we need to empty the text field, so we need to set the value of it. So element operation, set value. the element is this message input element. So we need to connect it just like this. All right. And the value is just an empty message. And in case of failure, we just show an error message. So show message, error, and we show the message we got. All right. All right, so now we're ready to go with this next step. So let's refresh the page. Let's click on this conversation. Now let's type in a message. So let's say hello world, and let's hit the send button. All right, so here it says undefined. Maybe the message was sent, maybe not. Let's double check. So let's go to the messages data model and let's see. All right, so the message was properly sent. This is the conversation ID. This is the ID of our current user, and this is the ID of our corresponding user. And the message was sent as you can see. So now the issue is that this value is as if it's not set. So let's just empty it and resave it. It's just a small bug we can fix. All right, let's double check. Does it work? Hit send perfectly. So now it empties the value with no issues. All right. So now you notice that we do send the messages, but we see nothing here. So we need to work on generating the list of messages, the last messages, but we also need to make sure that that this list is refreshed every so on. So we need to refresh this maybe every second, just to make sure that we always have the last messages displayed here. So for that, there's really different ways you can set this. The way I'm gonna set it is to add an action, and the trigger of this action is, let's say, whenever the element is rendered. All right, so this is going to be called refresh messages. And what we're going to do is we're going to first retrieve the current conversation. So data processing, element operation, get data. It's the messages element, and the name is conversation. All right. Now, when you first open the app, this is not going to be set. So we just can check if it's set. So program flow condition. So we make sure that this value is true. So it's set, it exists. And if it exists, we can keep on refreshing the message. So what we need to do is to retrieve the messages that correspond to this element. So we have here database data retriever, and here we retrieve the messages that correspond to a specific conversation. So conversation is input, and we need to do what we've done before. We need to specify specifically the messages that our user is sending or receiving from. So user ID or to user ID. All right. So this again is for security. We can only retrieve messages that are sent or received by our user. We can return the 100 last messages, date created, descending order, and we can click on OK. Now this is the conversation ID, so we can do get entry property, and here it's going to be ID, and this is the ID of the conversation. And here we can log the outputs just like this. So this is gonna trigger this action the first time the element is displayed on the page. But what we need to do is trigger this maybe every second or even less. So here in the beginning, what we're gonna do is that we're gonna create a loop. So a condition loop. So this will loop whenever this condition value is set to true. So whenever it's checked, it's gonna keep on looping. And we want to make this an infinite loop. So we just need to keep it checked, connect it like this. So this is when the loop ends, and this is the loop flow. So whenever it loops, it's gonna trigger this whole sequence of logic. And we need to just need to connect it like this. Now if you just keep it like this, it's gonna loop very fast. So instead I'm gonna add a delay. So program flow delay, and we're gonna loop every 1 second. You can make if you do that. An example of that is, let's say that the element doesn't have the conversation data attached to it. It's gonna go through this condition, and then it's gonna end here in the otherwise flow. And when it's end here, it's gonna keep on looping, but very fast. So we need to either add the delay here and here, or just add it at the beginning. For the sake of being just safe, let's put it at the beginning. It results in the same thing at the end. All right. So we can click on save, and we can save this. Now we can refresh the page. And now when we're going to click on this, it's going to attach the conversation data entry to this element. And this element right now, it's looping in the background, and it's going to start retrieving the messages from this, and it's going to log them here. All right, so I clicked, perfect. And now it's looping, and it's retrieving the messages. Now for some reason, it didn't retrieve the message. So this is not working as expected. So there's a problem that we need to solve here. It retrieves 0 messages, but we know that we do have a few messages in this conversation. So let's close this, and let's get back to this. So why is it that it doesn't retrieve the messages? So here we get the conversation data. So this works so far. And for the data retriever, here we get the conversation ID, and we put it in the conversation element. All right. We make sure that from is user.id, and that to is user.id. All right. We can save. Can make sure that this has, all right, yeah, this is normal. It doesn't have the conversation element attached to it. It's attached through this. We can remove this element. So here we attach the conversation data to the messages element. So when you're stuck in a problem like this, it's better to just log things one after the other. So let's log now this ID and make sure that this is okay. So refresh the page, and let's click here. All right, so this is 25D. Is it the conversation ID? Yes. Is it the message ID? Yes. All right. So something is not working right now. So maybe one thing that is not working is here the variable user.id. maybe the issue is here. So let's double check. Here we have the user. Alright, so no worries, it was not a problem in our no code or in our setup. It was an internal problem in Sketch, and I've fixed it right now. Alright, so now you can see that if you go to this page and refresh it, I'm gonna first log the actual data that we're retrieving. So this is the list of messages, and when we go back here and refresh, when I'm gonna click on this, you see that it's retrieving the messages here from this element. So to complete the app, the last major thing that we need to implement is to display the last messages that were added to this conversation. So to do that, we can head to the messages, the refresh messages action, and here we have seen that we were able to retrieve the list of messages, and now let's fill the element with these messages. So we can right click here, and in element manipulations we find the render element module. So this module allows you to generate new elements through this action. So the element is going to be a div block. You can click on OK, and actually we can even choose div text, just like this, and then we can loop through the messages that we have. So we can do program flow array loop. Alright, and now for each message that we have, we want to create a div block, so this one, so loop flow, and for this entry we want to take the message. So we go in data processing, entry, get entry property. So we want the message, and we take that message and put it as the content of this div text. And finally, we need to add the div text to the page, and we need to append it to the messages list element. So we can do element manipulation, append element. So the element we want to append is the div text that we have just created, and the parent is the messages element. So let's connect it like this, and let's move it back here. Now you might notice something, that we're gonna loop and append elements every time we retrieve these messages. But the important thing is that we need to basically empty the messages list before adding the messages again. So I'm gonna go to empty element, just like this, and the element we want to empty is our list of messages. So we basically empty it and refill it with our messages. Alright, maybe we can do it like this, so that we log the messages, we empty the block, and we continue. So we can already just save this and see what we have so far in our results. So I refresh the page and I click on the conversation, and now you see that it's adding the messages to the list, and it's looping through that. So it's continuously refreshing the list, it empties it, and it fills it again. Now of course we need some styling. We also need to if you remember, this was the first message and this was the second message. We need to list them in reverse because we want the latest messages to be displayed at the bottom. So we go back here, and in this array we want to reverse it. So data processing array, and we have the reverse function that will allow us to reverse the list of messages. Perfect. So now if we save, if we refresh, so now the messages are reversed, so we see the latest messages after. So test3, send, and it's displayed at the end. Perfect. So now we're gonna work on the styling of the messages. So for the sake of making tests, we can add a div text here. Maybe we can add 2. The first one, we're gonna call it message from me, and the second one is gonna be message from friend. All right, and we're gonna style these 2 messages by adding a class. So message self or message sent, and this one is going to be message received. All right, and of course we need to maybe work on the parent element. We want it to be a flex, as always, vertical, and we want to align the elements. Well, we don't need to align them right now. We can justify, however, to the end. So now that they are displayed to the end of the page. And now for the message from me. So we want to display these messages to the right. So align end, or maybe start. This one I'm gonna do start. So for this div block, maybe here if we do center, Alright, so this was a minor issue. Instead of using start and end, we need to use a flex start and flex end instead. Alright, so now we have, this is my messages and this is the messages that I receive. So we can add more styling, of course. We can add a padding here. So maybe 10 pixels everywhere. Okay. This is going to be the message, so we can add more padding here. Some good radius. And a background color. I'm gonna pick, so the messages from me are gonna be this color. And the messages that I receive are going to be plain white. Alright, and we can add the same styling we just did. Just like that. Can save, and that's pretty much enough for now. Maybe we can add well, I think yeah, we can add some shadow, very small. So something extremely light. Yeah, this sounds right. So I'm gonna do the same here. Yeah, all right. So we can save. And let's look at what we have so far. So we refresh the page and we need to click on this. It's gonna refresh the list of elements. And of course it doesn't work because we did not assign the classes to these div text elements. So what we're gonna do is go to the refresh messages action, and here this element we need to add a class to this element, and that class is going to depend on whether the message is coming from me or from my friend. So element operations, I'm going to add a class, set class. This is the element, and the class will be either, I think it was message received and message sent. All right, so the input here is going to depend on the ID of the message or the from field of the message. So we get first the ID, and that is the from field of this entry, and we compare that with our user ID. So we can do maybe a switch, maybe a switch logic. It's gonna be faster like this. So for switch logic, you have an input value, and you have either if it matches the first case or the if it matches other cases. In our case, we only have one. Yeah, so you need to at least have two inputs. So instead of that, I'm gonna choose maybe. You can really do things differently. So we're gonna take maybe another option, which is to just have a condition, a very simple condition, and we're gonna compare this to a to our user ID. So we go to data processing, get variable, and that variable is gonna be the user variable. I don't think we have it yet, and we get the ID of that variable. So entry get property, and this time is the ID of our user. All right, so now we get the ID of our user, we get the ID of the person who wrote the message, we compare both values. If they are the same, we add a specific class, otherwise we add a different class. So if it's the same, the class is message sent, otherwise it's message received. All right, just like that. And finally, when we've done that, we continue by appending the element to the page. Alright, we can now save and we can go back to our page. Alright, so we click on this and it doesn't work. So I'm gonna use the inspector to try to figure out what is not working. So yeah, it's as if it doesn't append the element to the page. We are receiving the messages, but it doesn't append the element to the page. So let's look into that. So everything is connected. Yeah. Alright, here is the problem. Forgot to connect this. And we can now refresh and open our message. And now it says, hello world, does it work? So of course we need to add some margin between the elements. So maybe 10 pixels or maybe 5 pixels is enough. Same here. Just like that. And now it looks very neat. So yeah, now this is supposed to be a message from me, but it's displaying it as if the message is received. So this is a problem. So where is the mistake? So this is message sent. So message sent is when our ID is the same as the from field of the message. Just to make sure, this is the from field 256 and it's our ID. So probably the problem is here. So when we get a variable, so maybe the user variable is not defined or is not exposed. Because to be able to use it in here, in the actions, you need to expose the variable. Now all the content of this variable can be seen by anyone. Now we can refresh, we can hit, and it works. Perfect. So we've pretty much done the major part of this tutorial. Now it's really about making things look prettier. So we need to maybe add the logo, the profile picture of the person we're talking to here with their name. We can display this as the conversation that is currently being viewed. Maybe we could even add, like, if you want, you can add, as I said, attachments, videos, emojis, and so on. So let's just go through this and make those easy changes right away. So the first thing is to try to display the logo of the person here. So I'm gonna add an image right here. Of course, we need to set the size. Just like that. And the radius. Perfect. So this is our image. And then we want to add the name of the person. I mean, it's not a text input, it's an inline text or just a div text if you want. So this is the div text. We want it to display next to this one, but the sidebar we applied the space between value. So if we change it here, it's gonna change here as well. There's few ways to solve this problem. The easiest one is probably just to add a div and put everything inside, just like that. And this div can be a flex element. You can remove the margin, horizontal, align items to the center, and now we can maybe add some margin here. Perfect. And whenever we click on the conversation, we want to update these fields. So this one is going to be the current conversation picture, and this one is going to be current conversation name. And now here, when you click on it, so now we're adding the data to the conversation to the messages element, but we also want to do a few things. So we're gonna retrieve first the element. So this one is picture. The other one is, we said, name, and we want to set the values of these fields. So for this one, well, first let's get the values. So data processing, entry, get entry property. We're gonna get the conversation, and we're gonna get a specific value, which is the correspondent dot profile picture, just like that. We take this value and we need to change the image here, and for that we're gonna use a set attribute, just like this, and the attribute is the source attribute of the image, and we want to set this value like this. Alright, maybe like this, it's a little bit more intuitive. And we do the same for the name of the conversation. So we get the entry property, and this one is correspondent dot username, and here it's setting the text of the element. We can connect everything, and we can already test and see if it works. So refresh, and when we click here, so for some reason there's some issues, so let's debug everything. So here the issue seems to be that we made a typo, so it's profile picture, and here we didn't set the input. So let's go get the input here and connect it like this. Alright, and now we refresh, and when we click, so now the test is working, but the image is not working. That is because for images we need to go and pick the URL of the image. So it's inside of the image value. We have to pick the URL and put it as the source value for the source attribute. Now we can refresh the page again, and hopefully now it's gonna work, and it works. Alright, so maybe something else we can do is when we click on this, we need to mark this as the current conversation. So we can either make a special class for this, otherwise we can just apply a background color to the element. So we can set style and we can set the background color, and the color we want is gonna be this hex color, and the element we want to add this color to is the one we just clicked, so the current element. Alright, and now you'll see I'm gonna do a test just to show you. We're gonna create a new conversation. Let's just remember the username, the third one, it's test2. So let's create that conversation. I'm gonna create that conversation. It's gonna be test2. Alright, and now when I'm gonna click on this conversation, you see that it works right now. And when I'm gonna click on the second one, it works, but the problem is that we need to remove the highlight that we've added to the first conversation. So for that, when we click on the conversation, yes, we do add the styling on the background, but we also need to remove the styling from the other siblings. So we select here the siblings of our element, just like that, and here we apply a style. It's going to be the background color, or maybe we can just remove a style, and the style we want to remove is the background color we just added, just like this. Now when we refresh, when we click on the first, it works like this. When you click on the second, it switches right away. Perfect. So now really the main thing that we can improve, it would be to, when we first open the page, we don't want these placeholder to show, and we don't want this whole area to show. Maybe we want to show like a standard message. So let's do that. So to do that, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna maybe add a div block to this area. Just make sure it's outside, right here. And in this div block, maybe I can write a message. So maybe we can put a div text inside. So select a conversation or create a new one to get started. Alright, and this one we're gonna add it, so it's gonna be the splash message. We want it to take the full dimension, so we're gonna add, well, I'm gonna first make it grow just like this. Right now it doesn't grow to the full area because this one also is visible, but we're gonna do that a little bit later. Again, I like to use flex, and I'm gonna center everything just like that. I'm gonna add maybe a background. Yeah, maybe something like this. Can center the text and add maybe, I'm gonna reset the default one and add a lot of margin here. Alright. Now what we want is to have this displayed by default when we first open the app, and whenever we click on this element we want to hide this and instead show these two elements instead. So how can we do that? Well, we can make these maybe hide as soon as they show up. Maybe there's really a lot of ways to do that. So we can hide the element. Alright, as soon as it's rendered. And same for this one. As soon as it's shown into the page, we want to hide it. Let's see now. Alright, so as soon as the page opens, they're automatically hidden, so you cannot see them. However, now when we click on this, we want to show them again. And I'm gonna do the same with the placeholder here. So I'm gonna hide it as soon as the page is displayed. Alright, and this one we need to show it, so I'm gonna add a tag, and it's gonna be current conversation, maybe something like that. And now when we click on this, we can first find the element. So the first is current conversation, only the first one, and what we want to do is we want to show the element. And we do the same with all the other tags, or maybe we can add the same tag and apply it automatically to all the elements right away. And that tag is going to be current conversation. So let's save. So this one has the tag, but these two elements don't have the tag. Just like this. And now whenever you click on an element on these conversations, it will automatically select all of the elements that have the current conversation tag, so this one, and this one, and it will show them in the page. Maybe one other thing I want to do before testing, I'm gonna set a hover effect. So whenever you hover the element, I want to add a background, and it's gonna be very slight. Well, for some reason it doesn't seem to work. Oh yeah, of course it doesn't work because I was not hovering on the image. So, perfect. So now we can refresh the page. So this one is still showing for some reason. The hover is working. When you click on the first one, it somehow works here. We also need to hide this. So this is a problem. And the problem is that we apply the styling directly on the element here. So I'm gonna add a class, current conversation, and make sure that it is flex just like this. And I'm gonna go to the selected element. I'm gonna reset these values. Alright, and this one I'm gonna add a tag, and it's gonna be splash message. And when we click on a conversation, we want to show the current conversation element, but also hide the splash element. Just like that. And now, when we refresh, yeah, of course, so here there's that problem that we didn't fix yet. So auto hide. So it's supposed to work. For some reason it doesn't. Oh, because it triggers when you click on it, but we want to trigger it whenever the element is rendered. So let's refresh the page. And now when we click on this, it shows the message. Now there's some sort of flicker. Yeah, that flicker is of course because it refreshes the message every second. We might want to reduce that. Also, maybe when you click on a message, we might want to just reset the list to avoid the flicker. So maybe that's something easy we can do. So when you click on a conversation, another thing that we want to do is, so this is the messages. We just want to empty the messages element. So empty element. And this will solve the flickering issue we just mentioned. So when we refresh, we click on this. So there's of course the delay. We can solve that. But here the flicker is no longer a problem. So we are pretty much done with this tutorial. Maybe one last thing to make sure that everything works is that maybe I can open a new private window, and I'm gonna open the app in it. So I'm just gonna copy this. Of course I copied it. It's a private window, so we're not logged in. So I can log in with one of the accounts I've created. What was the username? Alright, maybe I made a mistake in the password. So I'm just gonna reset the password here. So for test 1, I'm gonna reset the password. And now hopefully it's gonna work. Alright, now it works. And you see, so here's a bug. So which is why we're trying to do all this. So here the list of conversations, of course we can only see the conversation we are involved in, but when you click it, this seems to work. So the problem here is that the correspondent variable that we worked very hard on doesn't work. So let's fix that. So here we did all the work here to try to retrieve the correspondent variable, and one of them is probably working while the other isn't. Alright. So here the problem is really in case 2, and the problem is that this case 2, it's as if it never triggers. So case 2 is supposed to be the property user2.id. So this is very spaghetti code, but hopefully we're gonna make sense of this. So here I notice a difference between both is that this one is connected here, well this one isn't. So this might be the problem. Yeah, so this should not be connected here. We really want this to be connected here. All right. Now this is very unpleasant to work like this, but here you see that it works. All right, so that was a minor issue. And as you can see here, if I open both chat windows, you can probably talk with yourself just like that. Hey, and you see that it works here. Alright, so we have pretty much completed this tutorial. We have been able to create a chat system without writing a single line of code. It took us 2 hours, which is really good. Really the most difficult parts were this part specifically. So this is very messy. There's a lot of ways to do this, and this is probably not the cleanest way to do it. But of course, when you understand really how to do things, it's very repetitive. It's pretty much the same thing every time. If you want to modify an element from the actions, of course, you need to add a tag and so on. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. We have created a clone of the WhatsApp, or a very minimal clone of the web version of WhatsApp. And I hope you'll come back for future tutorials and maybe give a try to the Sketch.io platform. Thank you for listening, and